The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the highway as James Harper, a middle-aged black father, drove his family home from his son's basketball game. The car hummed steadily as laughter and conversation filled the cabin. James, ever the doting father, glanced in the rearview mirror to smile at his teenage daughter and young son. His wife, Maya, sat beside him, flipping through photos on her phone from the game. Then, the flashing red and blue lights appeared. "Is he pulling us over?" Maya asked, her voice tense. James's hands instinctively tightened on the steering wheel. "Yes," he replied evenly, signaling and pulling to the side of the road. James's heart pounded. He'd done nothing wrong, but experience told him that didn't always matter. The stories of countless black men replayed in his mind. Ordinary traffic stops turned confrontational, or worse. He took a deep breath and reminded himself to stay calm. As the officer approached, his posture was rigid, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. James rolled down the window, his movements slow and deliberate. "License and registration." The officer barked without a greeting, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the family. James complied, handing over the documents. The officer studied them, then peered back at James. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, officer," James replied, keeping his tone respectful. "You were swerving," the cop said flatly. James knew this wasn't true. His driving had been meticulous. "Swerving?" Maya echoed under her breath, her voice barely audible. "Yes," the officer snapped, his gaze shifting to her. "Ma'am, I'll ask you to remain silent unless spoken to." The air in the car grew heavy. James could feel the tension rising in his children, and his primary concern was keeping them safe. The officer's questions turned invasive, his tone growing harsher. He seemed to be searching for something, anything, to justify the stop. James felt the weight of a systemic problem pressing down on him, but he resolved to respond in a way that would diffuse the situation and leave a lasting impact. James took a deep breath, glancing briefly at his wife, who gave him a subtle nod of support. He turned back to the officer, his expression calm and collected. "Officer," James began, his voice steady, "I'd like to understand more about this alleged swerving. I've been driving carefully, especially with my family in the car. Could you provide more specifics?" The officer's expression hardened. "I call it as I see it. Are you questioning my judgment?" James noted the accusatory tone and the not-so-subtle undertone of authority being challenged. He knew this was a delicate line to walk, responding assertively without escalating the situation. "No, sir," James replied. "I'm just seeking clarity. My priority is my family's safety, and I want to make sure we're following all the rules." The officer took a step back, clearly irritated. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Maya's sharp intake of breath was audible. "James," she whispered, her hand reaching for his. "It's okay," James said softly, squeezing her hand before opening the door. He stepped out slowly, his hands visible. Standing face to face with the officer, James felt the weight of decades of systemic bias. This wasn't just about him. This was about the countless stories of black men and women stopped, questioned, and often judged unfairly. The officer began his line of questioning, veiled with insinuations. "You've got your family here, big man." "Huh? Where are you headed in such a hurry?" "We're heading home from my son's basketball game," James answered simply. "You play basketball, son?" the officer asked, looking past James at the young boy in the back seat. His tone was casual, but there was something unsettling about the way he asked. "Yes, sir," the boy replied hesitantly. "Good sport," the officer muttered, his gaze returning to James. "Mind if I search the vehicle?" James hesitated. He knew his rights, but also understood the risk of appearing uncooperative. Calmly, he responded, "Officer, I'd like to understand the reason for the search. Is there probable cause?" The officer's expression darkened. "Are you a lawyer now?" he snapped. "No, sir," James said evenly. "I'm just a father who knows his rights." The exchange hung heavy in the air, the officer clearly annoyed but unable to find fault in James's demeanor. The tension was palpable, with James's children watching their father handle the situation with quiet strength. The deeper issue became evident. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It was a confrontation rooted in systemic bias. The officer's demeanor reflected the ingrained stereotypes that painted black men as threats, regardless of their actions. As the questioning dragged on, James maintained his composure, refusing to allow the officer's aggression to provoke him. His calm, measured responses began to unsettle the officer, who seemed to expect anger or defiance. "Are we free to go, officer?" James finally asked after a long pause. The officer stared at him for a moment before stepping back. "Stay here," he muttered, walking back to his patrol car. Inside the car, Maya whispered, "James, you handled that so well. But this isn't right." James nodded, his jaw tight. "I know," he said softly, "but we have to stay calm. That's how we win." The officer returned moments later, handing back James's license and registration. "You're free to go," he said curtly, avoiding eye contact. James got back into the car, the silence heavy as they pulled away. But as they drove, his son's voice broke the quiet. "Dad, how did you stay so calm?" James glanced at him in the rearview mirror, a small, weary smile on his face. "Because sometimes, son, the best way to fight isn't with anger. It's with strength, patience, and knowing who you are." As the family drove in silence, the weight of the encounter lingered in the car. James could see his wife staring out of the window, her hands clenched in her lap, while his children exchanged nervous glances in the back seat. Finally, Maya broke the silence. "James, you were incredible back there. But this isn't just about us. This keeps happening, and it's not right." James nodded, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "I know, Maya. And it's not going to stop unless people start holding them accountable." That evening, after the kids went to bed, James sat at the kitchen table with Maya, recounting the events of the day. Together, they decided that this couldn't just be another story to share among friends and family. It needed to be documented and addressed. "I'm going to file a formal complaint," James said firmly. Maya raised an eyebrow. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" James paused, acknowledging the cynicism in her voice. "It might not. But if no one speaks up, nothing will ever change." The next day, James began his investigation into the officer's actions. He requested a copy of the body cam footage from the traffic stop and reviewed the legal procedures for filing a misconduct report. To his surprise, the footage revealed even more about the officer's behavior. On the recording, the officer could be heard muttering under his breath, probably hiding something. "They always are." James's chest tightened as he replayed the footage. The officer's words confirmed what he had felt in the moment. This wasn't about a traffic violation. It was about bias. James took the footage and began compiling evidence, researching similar cases of racial profiling in his community. He reached out to local advocacy groups and found others who had experienced similar treatment. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The same officer had been reported multiple times for discriminatory behavior, but no action had been taken. "This isn't just about us," James told Maya one evening. "This is a systemic problem, and it's going unchecked. But now we have proof." James's efforts attracted the attention of a local journalist, who interviewed him for an article on racial profiling in the area. The story gained traction, sparking conversations on social media and drawing support from civil rights organizations. One evening, James received an email from a retired police captain who had read the article. The captain offered to meet and share insights into the culture within the department that allowed such behavior to persist. Over coffee, the retired captain explained, "The problem isn't just bad officers. It's the culture that protects them. Most people don't know their rights or don't feel empowered to stand up. What you did out there was remarkable, James. But more people need to do the same." This conversation became a turning point for James. It wasn't enough to file a complaint or share his story. He wanted to empower others to do the same. He began organizing workshops in his community, teaching people about their rights during police encounters and how to document incidents of misconduct. As the months passed, the officer who had pulled over James faced mounting scrutiny. Public pressure led to an internal investigation, and more people came forward with similar complaints. The department was forced to address the issue, implementing mandatory bias training and reviewing its policies on traffic stops. The momentum grew, but James knew the fight wasn't over. "This is just the beginning," he told Maya one night. "We've planted a seed, but it's going to take a lot more to see real change." The turning point came when James was invited to speak at a community forum organized by a coalition of local activists, civil rights leaders, and concerned citizens. The event aimed to address racial profiling and push for police accountability. Standing before the audience, James felt a mix of emotions: nervousness, determination, and a deep sense of responsibility. He shared his story, emphasizing not just the fear and tension of that traffic stop, but also the strength it took to respond with composure. "I stood there, not just as a black man," James told the crowd, "but as a father, a husband, and a human being who deserves respect. And so does every single person in this room." His words struck a chord. Applause filled the room as attendees nodded in agreement, many of them relating to his experience. But James didn't stop at recounting the incident. He proposed actionable steps. "We need more than apologies or promises," he said firmly. "We need policies that protect people from being profiled. We need transparency, accountability, and education, for officers and for us as citizens." His speech sparked a ripple effect. Community leaders began organizing petitions, pushing for changes in local law enforcement policies, such as requiring body cameras to be activated during all stops and creating an independent review board for complaints against officers. Meanwhile, the officer involved in James's stop, Officer Daniels, faced growing pressure. Initially defensive, Daniels found himself questioning his actions as the public scrutiny intensified. In a rare move, Daniels requested a meeting with James. Reluctantly, James agreed, though he wasn't sure what to expect. When they met in a neutral space, Daniels seemed different, less combative, more reflective. "I've been thinking a lot about that day," he began, his voice hesitant. "I didn't realize how much of my behavior was shaped by assumptions. I want to apologize." James studied him carefully, unsure of the sincerity behind the words. "An apology is a start," he replied, "but the real question is, what are you going to do to change?" The conversation was tense but honest. Daniels admitted to his biases and expressed a desire to unlearn them. He asked James for advice on how to connect better with the community, a request that surprised James. "You start by listening," James said simply. "Not just to me, but to everyone you've wronged." As more people rallied behind James's cause, the local police department announced a series of reforms, including officers were required to undergo extensive training to address racial bias and learn de-escalation techniques. A panel of community members was established to review complaints against officers and ensure accountability. Officers were encouraged to participate in community events, fostering trust and mutual understanding. The story of James's traffic stop gained national attention, sparking conversations about racial profiling across the country. Activists in other cities reached out to James, asking for advice on how to organize similar efforts in their communities. James realized the power of his platform. He began traveling to schools, churches, and community centers, sharing his story and empowering others to stand up against injustice. At home, the impact of James's actions was deeply felt by his family. His son, who had once been quiet and uncertain, began to speak up more confidently in class discussions about social issues. His daughter wrote an essay about her father's bravery, which won first place in a statewide competition. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Maya looked at James with pride. "You turned a moment of fear into a movement for change," she said. "That's not just bravery, that's leadership." James smiled, his heart full. "I just want to make sure that no one else has to feel the way we did that day." Years passed, but the memory of that traffic stop remained fresh in James's mind. What had started as a moment of fear and frustration had grown into something far greater, a movement for accountability and justice. The reforms James and his community fought for continued to shape policing in their city. Complaints of racial profiling decreased significantly, and the relationship between the police and the community began to mend. Officers were no longer seen as adversaries, but as partners working toward a shared goal of safety and respect. The community workshops James initiated grew into a nonprofit organization, Know Your Rights Coalition, which provided legal resources, educational programs, and advocacy training for marginalized communities. The group partnered with local schools to teach students about civil rights, fostering a generation more aware of their legal protections and responsibilities. At one workshop, A young black man approached James and said, "Your story gave me the courage to speak up when I was unfairly stopped. I didn't know how to handle it before, but because of what I learned here, I stayed calm, documented everything, and filed a report. It made a difference." Hearing stories like this reminded James that progress, though slow, was real. For James, the journey had transformed him as much as it had the world around him. He often reflected on the courage it took to remain calm and composed during that pivotal traffic stop. "What kept you so calm?" a reporter once asked him during an interview. James smiled, recalling the moment. "It wasn't easy," he admitted, "but I knew that losing my composure wouldn't just hurt me, it would hurt my family. It would confirm every stereotype the officer had about me. I stayed calm because I knew that strength isn't about shouting. It's about standing firm in who you are." James's family had also grown stronger. His son and daughter, now young adults, had taken up causes of their own, one as a journalist highlighting social injustice, the other as a lawyer fighting for civil rights. They often credited their father's bravery and resilience as their inspiration. The story of James's encounter continued to resonate beyond his community. It became a case study in law schools and a topic of discussion in police academies. James was invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing his insights on how ordinary people could drive extraordinary change. One of the most meaningful moments for James came years later when he was invited to a ceremony at the police department. The officer who had stopped him, Daniels, was now leading diversity and inclusion training for the force. Daniels publicly acknowledged James's impact, saying, "That day changed my life. James didn't just teach me about bias. He showed me what integrity looks like." In his final public speech as the leader of his nonprofit, James addressed a packed auditorium. "The fight for justice is never over," he said. "But progress starts with one moment, one voice, one decision to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.' We all have that power. The question is, what will you do with yours?" The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet. James looked out at the crowd, filled with people of all backgrounds, united by a shared hope for a better future. As he stepped away from the podium, his wife, Maya, greeted him backstage with a hug. "You did it," she said, tears in her eyes. James smiled. "We did it." Driving home that night, James felt a deep sense of peace. The road ahead would always have challenges, but he knew the journey was worth it. He glanced in the rearview mirror, just as he had on the day of the traffic stop, and saw not fear or uncertainty, but hope. He turned to Maya and said, "We've come a long way, haven't we?" She nodded, her eyes shining. "And there's no stopping now."